There's a debate around insider versus outsider. Do you change things by going into institutions and working within them, or do you stand outside, protest, picket, and call for those inside a building?
My personal instinct and preference, and what I think I'm better suited to do, is to be in.
Lord David Neuberger served as the President of the United Kingdom Supreme Court from 2012 until 2017. He's a distinguished legal figure, known for his extensive career in the legal profession. Prior to this role, Lord Neuberger had a successful career as a barrister, eventually being appointed as a High Court judge in 1996, where he handled a wide range of cases in the realms of property law, insolvency law, and IP law. Lord Neuberger's dedication to the legal field extended beyond the courtroom, as he chaired an investigation council into widening access to the barrister profession. His multifaceted career reflects his profound impact on the legal world and his commitment to promoting fairness and access within the profession. Let's learn.
I think the big problem is we are in a world which is very fast changing, and the law and constitutional systems and governmental systems aren't really very good at making quick changes. And that is something you have to face. But having said that, I absolutely accept that our system needs to be reviewed and changed as time goes on.
Well, thank you so much, David, for joining us at the School of Social Justice. We are in our second series where we interview people who have made a difference to learn from people like you about how you actually practically change the world on a multiple range of issues related to social justice. Really appreciate your time. And I'm sure the audience is really keen to learn about your experience and how you believe we can address some of the most important and challenging problems of our time. So welcome.
Thank you.
First off, it would be wonderful to hear a bit about yourself and what you do now. And we met just whilst I was starting to look at the issues that are impacting society when it came to technological changes and the fourth industrial revolution. And we worked quite closely on inquiry to find out what those problems were and how citizens can respond. And then we later worked together when I was suing Facebook on behalf of 1.1 million people as part of a class action. And I've learned so much from you during that time, and so I'm really keen to share some of your lessons throughout your career that you've learned. So first off, tell us a bit about yourself and what you're up to now.
Well, you're very nice about me. I have had a very privileged and unchallenged upbringing, in the sense that my parents were sort of successful middle-class couple. My father was a university professor, and my mother was a sculptress. I was privately educated, went to university. The only odd thing about my career at that stage, from the point of view of where I've ended up, is that I was a scientist at university.
I don't know.
And I then went into banking. I wasn't a very good scientist. I was a much worse banker. And then I found my career third time round as a barrister. And I practiced as a barrister for 20 years. Then I became a High Court judge and was lucky enough to get up the system and became ultimately president of the UK Supreme Court, which is, I suppose, the top judicial job in this country. And on retiring at 70, which was the compulsory retirement age, I've since then been involved in various charities, but have spent most of my time, it has to be said, doing arbitrations, which is sort of private judging, doing mediations, which is trying to help people solve their disputes without going to court, and giving occasional opinions on law. I've had a very lucky life as well as a privileged start. On my way, I've done one or two things which have helped. I hope I've had social justice in my mind as a judge. I hope I've been made more conscious of the need for social justice as a judge. And I, for instance, chaired a committee to investigate improving access to the bar. The barrister's world is, I'm afraid, still very much a privileged job, in the sense that people who've been fortunate enough to have access to education privately have tended to come to the bar. People with private money, as I was able to do, not a great deal, but enough, have been able to make it to become barristers when others may not have been able to find the money. So I'm conscious that I've been privileged, and I'm conscious that that's not fair, and that others should have, and everyone should have a similar opportunity.
I mean, first off, just to comment on the fact that you took a couple of moves before you found what ended up being your long-term calling, and that's really fascinating, particularly for our audience who are trying to figure out what role they play in society and how they can contribute to making it fairer. But also I appreciate your kind of openness and honesty there about recognizing your privilege, and also actually throughout your work you have, done so much for the justice system, which is so crucial to ensuring that change happens on a sort of almost everyday basis in the courts and so forth. And I'd love to know a bit more about your experience as President of Supreme Court in a little bit. But I'm curious to know, first off, what do you perceive social justice to mean?
I think social justice in the end involves, and this sounds very trite, but it involves, justice itself involves treating everyone fairly and equally. Whether you're very privileged and very rich, or very poor and very uneducated, you deserve to be treated in the same way. But in the same way immediately begs a question, because if you're very privileged and very well educated, then in a sense you shouldn't be treated in the same way as somebody who is poorly educated and not well informed. Because equality involves putting each such person in the same position. And so it isn't as easy as it sounds. Social justice involves trying to iron out these differences between the privileged and well-educated and rich and the not so fortunate. Human life being what it is, the idea that you're going to have a situation and should be aiming for a situation where everybody is equal is completely impractical and unrealistic, and if you really pursue it, positively dangerous. So these things are quite nuanced, but what you have to do is to give everybody equal respect, whatever their background and education and whatever their influence, whatever their abilities. But you also, and this is what really matters, you have to give everybody, if so far as you can, an equal opportunity to realize their abilities. These things are easy to say, but very difficult to achieve. But that's not a reason for not doing our best to try and achieve them.
And why should people try to achieve them, particularly when sometimes the criticism will be, well, why should I care for a stranger? Why should I care for wider society when actually I've got my own problems to deal with? How does one respond to that?
Well, I think that as a judge or any other body concerned, any other individual concerned with fairness, you want to have a society which is fair to everybody. Secondly, if you are privileged and lucky, you don't want to risk a society where your property is taken away, where your influence and privilege is totally removed, where you may actually be shot or something by society, and you need a happy society. And if you don't let people achieve their aims and don't let people fulfill their ambitions, in the long run that's going to undermine society. And the third reason is that if you are stopping, as in practice we are, a very high proportion of people from achieving their ability and their potential, you are actually making society less successful than it should be. Because if you have you're fishing from a small pond, you're not getting all the most able people who are outside the pond. And if you're not getting the most able people, society suffers because they are A, dissatisfied, and B, not contributing to the economy. So it's in everyone's interest, as well as society's interest, and as well as being right, that we try and enable everybody to achieve their potential.
That's a great way to kind of inspire people to take action. And also, I guess then a follow-up question then is how? There are so many methods to address the multitude of issues, whether it be climate injustice, racism, sexual discrimination, harassment, human rights abuses. The list goes on and on. You've chosen or had a career which is all in the legal sector, and of course, as you said, having the most prominent job within that sector. How can the law be used to achieve social justice?
I think the answer is the law can definitely have an effect. In the 1960s, before I became a lawyer, while I was still at university or school, the government passed legislation, Parliament passed legislation to stop race discrimination, racial discrimination.
Only in the 60s?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's when it was properly done for the first time. And up to that time, you saw signs in windows, room to let, no Irish or no blacks or something like that, quite inconceivable now. And that was made unlawful, that was made illegal. And of course, gender discrimination and so on. So the law undoubtedly has a role to play, because I think it may be that society was going that way anyway, but the law definitely can play a part by rendering things illegal so that people actually are punished and seem to be punished for doing things which are unacceptable. You've got to be careful. You shouldn't be legislating for people having good manners, but doing things which are demeaning and frankly immoral, like being racist or sexist, that's quite right that it should be illegal.
I mean, for you as a judge, you have made judgments on real people all the time, and it impacts their lives. And therefore, at scale, when you have many judges doing the same, clearly the impact you have on society is immense. Real people's lives being affected and impacted. Where does the role of a judge like yourself stand in this place of moving the needle in terms of progress and social fairness?
In this country, judges have, if you like, less social power than in some countries.
Okay.
We don't have a coherent, detailed constitution, like, for instance, in the United States, where the Supreme Court can override decisions of the government, of the legislature, the Senate and House of Representatives. Courts here can't override decisions of Parliament. We can interpret decisions of Parliament and statutes, but we can't override them. And so there's a limited role, but with the introduction of the Human Rights Act in 1998 into this country, judges were given considerably extended powers in terms of ensuring that individuals' rights of freedom of expression, freedom to marry, and so on, were given effect to properly. And inevitably, there are some judges who are more progressive, more anxious to push the boundaries a bit than others. But I think that the oddity about being a judge compared with being an MP is that a judge will decide an individual case. And that's all judges can do, because you decide the case in front of you. Whereas Parliament is deciding to make laws that apply to everybody. But in our system, when a judge decides a case, particularly if it's in the top court, in the Supreme Court, it's often decided on a point of principle, which is a general application. And I think that within the bounds of what is proper for a judge to do, a sensible judge will undoubtedly bear in mind the implications of a decision, particularly if it's to do with something like human rights or social fairness. And everything being equal, one will try and ensure that one is giving a decision which is going to make society more just, rather than the opposite.
You mention Parliament and lawmaking. Of course, in the UK, happens in Westminster and around the country in terms of related institutions. You are a lord, you are a peer. what does that look like in terms of the processes, particularly for people who, maybe in the future want to follow in your footsteps and try to get a peerage and make a difference in the House of Lords? How does that all work?
The House of Lords is an anomalous body of people, and there's not the slightest doubt that if you were inventing a constitutional system from scratch, nobody in their right minds would include a legislative body which is made up in the way that the House of Lords is made up. But you have to bear in mind that a country like this doesn't have its constitution created yesterday. It's gradually built up over the years. I am strongly in favour of modifying and changing the House of Lords, but I think before one gets too critical about it, one should bear in mind that it is part of an organic system that has grown over the years. And I think that's an important point when you're thinking about how to change it.
Okay.
And the first thing you, in my view, would do is not decide how it should be selected. The first thing you should do is to decide what actually the function of the House of Lords is. Because until you've decided on its role, you can't really decide how it should be, how its members should be chosen. But I think its role should be such that it doesn't undermine the legitimacy of the House of Commons, but it should have some teeth. And at the moment, you could argue the actual powers of the House of Lords are quite well judged, because it can reverse legislation passed by the House of Commons. It can, by sending it back to the House of Commons, and it can stick to its guns. But under the present rule, if the House of Commons says we're not going to go along with the House of Lords, after a certain amount of time, the House of Commons view prevails. So in the end, you could argue what the House of Lords has is two functions. One is ultimately advisory, saying to the House of Commons, this is not a good idea, and the other is delaying, holding up the legislation while the House of Commons thinks about it. But in the end, the House of Commons, being the democratically legitimate organisation, is the one that prevails.
I think one criticism that Parliament often faces is the lack of diversity within its institutions, whilst also this sense that it's so far removed from ordinary folk. My experience, having worked for a Member of Parliament in my early 20s, is actually MPs often know more about people than most, because it's their job to represent, of course, constituents, reading research and reports about the state of the nation and the concerns of people who are polled and who contribute to research. And also the bit about diversity. There's so many challenges within these institutions that people kind of tend to dismiss them and say we need to get rid of them. That's the only means through which we can achieve social justice for us to have a clean start. I mean, for me, as someone who values these institutions which have evolved over decades and centuries, the reason why they're bureaucratic and detailed is because it's needed to change and develop and evolve over time to deal with complex matters. I mean, what should the future of these institutions be, from the Supreme Court and the House of Lords and Parliament, particularly for people who are trying to shape it? I mean, people who are watching this are wanting to make society better, and part of the solution might be reform within institutions.
I agree with everything you've said. I think the big problem is this. Due to technological change, due to ease of communications, due to the fast pace in social change, we are in a world which is very fast changing. And the law and constitutional systems and governmental systems aren't really very good at making quick changes. And in the past, changes have happened, as you say. The idea that the House of Commons, House of Lords, the judicial system, whatever you like, are ossified and haven't changed for decades or let alone centuries is nonsense. They have changed. There have been quite a few changes. But the problem has been the changes have been organic. It's one of the strengths of this country. We haven't needed revolutions to change. We have changed as things needed to be changed. But the trouble now is that the changes are perceived to be needed very quickly, and often the changes themselves change. And the system is not very good at coping with that, because if you change too quickly, you haven't had time to think about it, and it may not work very well. And that is something you have to face. But having said that, I absolutely accept that our system needs to be reviewed and changed as time goes on. And it may be that there should be some system set up for continually reviewing how things are working, rather than setting up a committee or an organisation to consider change on a specific basis or specific way. But I think that one of the problems in this country, relative to a large number of other countries, is a lack of diversity. And the lack of diversity that people are most conscious of is on the gender front and on the ethnic front. But the one that I think is the worst in this country, and it does reflect in the ethnic problem, not so much in the gender problem, is social background.
Class,
if you like. Absolutely, class. It is the problem. And it comes back to what I said right at the beginning. I had a privileged background. I could, and I had the money to change jobs early on in my career, and it finished me off financially, but it was able to end up. And things have changed. For instance, at the bar, I actually had a difficult time getting into being a barrister. It took me a couple of years. I almost gave up. But in those days, as a pupil, as a trainee barrister, you were not paid any money. You just had to work and hope that you would get offered a tenancy, like a membership of chambers, like a partnership in a firm. You hoped to be taken on, but you had to work for nothing. So if you had private means, it was fine. But if you didn't, you either had to get no sleep and work, or you couldn't do it. Now that's changed, and all pupils, all trainee barristers have to be paid. So that has improved things. The disadvantage is, because you've got to pay them, there are many fewer pupilages. So it's a more difficult career to get into, but at least it's the same, or nearer to the same, for people irrespective of their financial circumstances.
I'm just going to check the time. Okay, we've got around 9 minutes. So just on that, it's a great example of a specific change that's occurred in our history in this country. What was the cause of that?
Perceived unfairness. It was just felt that rich people could come to the bar because they could do a year's pupillage without being paid anything, and poor people either couldn't or would face much greater difficulties because they would have to earn money and therefore couldn't give their 24/7 attention to impressing people by their work and getting taken on.
So it starts with perceptions, seeing something, feeling and knowing that it is wrong, inherently wrong, and saying enough is enough, we need to do something about it, and then figuring out a means to achieve
exactly. The change like that, it's not easy. The people who did it deserve great praise. But the changes that are much more difficult are the changes that are needed not within a profession like that, but within society generally. Lawyers can't change the enormous unfairness in society between people who get privately educated and private tutoring and time to study and no need to work in stacking shelves or whatever, and people who don't have that advantage. And that's a societal problem that is much more difficult to solve. The other type of problem, which I think is really difficult to solve, is the almost subconscious cultural problem.
Okay.
I mean, there's an interesting thing about women in the law. If you look at the start, the number of women solicitors is just more than 50%. The number of women barristers at the beginning is just less than 50%. You go to the top of the profession, women are about 13%. So it's not an entry problem, it's a cultural problem within the system, which is partly cultural within the law and the way lawyers see. And it's not it's not because they are consciously biased, but they're subconsciously biased. And it's partly a societal thing that law is a fairly demanding career. And if a man and a woman, each in the same position, have children to look after, have elderly parents to look after, it will almost always be the woman who does that, and her career will suffer. I've seen in my children that this is slightly changing, and there's not quite as much. It's not quite as one-sided, but it still is one-sided.
There's a couple more questions, because for me, whilst you speak, what becomes clear is that there's a debate around insider versus outsider. Do you change things by going into institutions and working within them, or do you stand outside, protest, picket, and call for those inside a building to make it? Or do you do a balancing act of both? I mean, you've clearly rose to the ranks of being an insider in one of the most important institutions internationally. Was it a specific choice to do that, or kind of for people considering what role to play, insider or outsider? What would you say to them?
I think there's room for both. My personal instinct and preference, and what I think I'm better suited to do, is to be inside doing it. I'm a more consensual person. I'm more interested in persuading, acting by example. I'm not so good at being more shouty. But the truth is that without the shouty people, it may be that a lot of changes that should happen don't happen. I think the danger of the protesting and noises from outside is that it makes some people, if you're talking about, for instance, outside the legal profession, it makes people within the legal profession defensive. And that's not necessarily helpful. But I do think that it helps to shock some people in a world like the legal world into thinking by noises from outside, as well as by people trying to change it more quietly inside. I think it's a bit of both.
I agree. And for me, I've tried to play a balancing act to be able to speak with people directly who have the power and levers to make a difference, but also ensure that, there's people on the outside that we listen to and work with alongside, in order to make sure that real change is happening for real people who aren't necessarily the most privileged. I mean, I know we don't have much time left. My final question is around the skills and the ways of learning. So for people who might want to be a judge and take this route that you've taken, people who want to be a future David and be in your shoes, what kind of skills are necessary to be a brilliant judge?
One thing I always say to people when they're talking about their future as to what they need is, it's a very unhelpful thing to say, but it's something it's important, I think, to bear in mind, is you need luck. It's not a helpful thing to say, except that it's a factor to bear in mind when things don't go the way they should, even when you've worked hard and feel you've really contributed and you don't get the recognition or the success that you feel you should have got. Console yourself with the thought that there is luck here. But there's no doubt that if you work hard, if you're pleasant, if you're honest, and if you're intelligent, and if you're constructive, you improve your luck a great deal. But I think that the other thing is you've got to be, you've got to be strong sometimes. I mean, even I, with my privileged background, had 18 months of 3 successive pupilages. In those days, it was easier to get pupilages, as I've said, but more difficult to get to the next stage. I had 3 successive pupilages where I worked hard for 6 months, 3 lots of 6 months, and didn't get taken on in the chambers I was in. Somebody else did, and I almost gave up. And I think perseverance is a very important quality. You never quite know what's round the corner, and often what seem unfortunate, even disastrous events do turn out beneficially. I said I got turned down by several chambers. I ended up in what I thought was a less good chambers. But looking back on it, they suited me very well. I think if you come from a less privileged background, things may be more difficult, because particularly if you move into a world like the legal world where there are conventions and so on, your more privileged counterparts may have been brought up with children of lawyers or so on, and will know the rules. I think even 20 years ago, people didn't think of that. I think now they are aware of it. Don't get chippy. It's very easy to get chippy and quite understandable. But the important thing is, as far as you can, is just stick with it. And things should be all right if you stick with it, if you're hardworking and if you're dedicated. Nothing is guaranteed, of course. So I don't have any magic bullet. But I think hard work, pleasantness, commitment, intelligence and friendliness are key. And standing up for yourself, but not necessarily doing it too aggressively. But do bear in mind that if you don't stand up for yourself, you can't be sure anybody else will.
That's a powerful statement, and you've got me thinking a lot. That bit about standing up for yourself is also important in terms of standing up for other people who might be less able to do so, and I think that's one of those things where for social justice to happen, we need to figure out
I think that's a very, very important point, because when I've been to universities, less sort of privileged universities, I've been to less privileged schools and talked to people about the potential. If you're really committed and want to be lawyers and you're hardworking and intelligent, then I really hope you can do it. But however much I talked, however much I said it, when I was there with somebody who'd been to a school like that or to university like that and who'd made it as a lawyer, that was worth 100 times what I said, because they could say, look at me, I came from your background and I did this. That's why what you say is so important. When you are embarking on your career and hoping to be a successful lawyer from what will often not be a very privileged background, the other thing that should be driving you is that you're going to be a role model. And in due course, when you make it, go back to the schools and universities and other places to encourage people like you to do it and say, you've done it and that they can do it.
Thank you so much, David. Listen, despite us coming from very different backgrounds, my mother came to the country as a chambermaid to clean hotels in the Lake District. As you know, my father came here to work as a waiter. You've been a role model to me, to be quite cheesy about it. But for real, I think one of those things is that you don't necessarily need to see yourself in somebody. You can just see somebody and their talents and their contributions to others who might be different to them, for you to see a way of going about things. And you've done that for me and countless many other people who are following your footsteps. And now the School of Social Justice audience who have listened to you for this masterclass. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Is there any final word you want to share before we go?
I don't think so, except to say that if you do come from a less privileged background and you do want to make it in the law, there are a lot of people in the law who may not sound it and may not look like it, but who will be rooting for you and wanting to encourage you. And you are not only doing it for yourself. The more people who can be recruited into the law and indeed into other professions from backgrounds which are not traditionally supplying lawyers and are not privileged, you're not merely, if those people who come into the profession are doing the country a lot of good as well as themselves. And you are also leading the way for others, I very much hope.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate your time, and farewell. I'll see you soon, and really appreciate your contributions.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
This educational content is absolutely free. Why? Because our vision is a world where anybody, no matter their background, can learn how to make a difference. To keep going, we need your help. Can you become our next patron? Can you help us reach 2,500 patrons? I really hope so. Whatever the case, hope you learned something today, and sending you peace and love. Let's keep learning.